Good evening and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and what we do on this show every Tuesday night is we read old folk tales and fairy tales. Tonight's stories are going to come to us from Germany, and they are going to theme themselves around romance and a little bit of tragedy. Actually, a lot of tragedy. I'll try to leave us on a happier note and start us on a tragic one, because we are going to read multiple stories tonight. If you've never been on this channel before, this is varietal literature. We do stuff to do with stories and narrative. On Thursdays, we play games that involve writing, if that interests you. But tonight I will read you some stories, play a little bit of music in the background, add in some sound effects here and there, and for the most part, just to try to enrapture you a little bit in old folklore. If you do not want to hear any preamble or anything down like that, and you're not watching us live, then down in the description below there will be timestamps. You can click on timestamps to take you to whichever story interests you the most. If you want the most tragic story that I think takes a good note from Greek tragedy, then you can check out the first story we're going to talk about tonight, called the Count of Windeck. But if you want the longer and more torrid affair, the sort of Capulets and Montagues of German folklore, then I would invite you to check out the second story that we're going to read tonight, called The Stone Cross of Teufelsthal Valley. But obviously, if you want to watch them both, then I'm happy to have you. Now, if you are here live, down in the corner, and YouTube kind of buries it a little bit, is what side of it is for you? I should just mirror my camera so you guys look at things the way for me. For me, it's this way, so it must be this way. Is the live chat. And you're welcome to join in the live chat. There's usually a little bit of discussion going on in there about the crazy and sad and strange things that happen in folktales, and that is absolutely a part of telling folktales, is people murmuring and adding their own thoughts. And there's two in there already. I see that GS is here. It says good evening, and then gives a heart with an arrow through it that says romance. And Shayna Towers is back. Hello, Shayna. It's good to see you. I hope your week is going well. Ours has been very hot. Well, hot for Canada, which actually is a lot harder than people think. We get a reputation for snow, and it is true, most of the country gets covered in snow, but people don't live in most of the country. Most of the country is crammed down at the border, where it gets quite warm in the summer and humid. Because where I live is actually the only place in the world with this type of rainforest, and it is an actual rainforest, and it is humid. So we'll see if I get shiny while telling stories. Anyhow, again, if you want to skip this stuff, there will be timestamps in the description. You can skip over any conversation. I'm going to briefly talk about tonight's stories, but I'm going to put a lot less time in it than usual, because I think it's a lot more obvious what they are and what they're about. But I always have something to say before we tell these stories. So Again, timestamps if you don't want to hear it. But tonight's story is concerned romance in German folklore. And in part because of the translator that we're coming to, this romance is going to be tied to real world. I say tied to, not necessarily based on, because it very often is little association between the realities that these tales give and what is known about relationships that occur. And sometimes they amount to basically fan fiction, which is something that our translator of these tales, Jürgen Hubert, mentions a few times in his notes, that it's sort of like you knew there was this story of tragedy, and so you just sort of flesh it out and told a fairly fictionalized version of it. So what we're going to see, it doesn't have a lot of fantastical qualities, and it's not going to have the quality of a fairy tale, because those tend to be float above time and place. These are going to have the weight of locations, and supposedly it happened on this cliff in Germany, and, you know, so on and so forth. And I think that gives them a very different feel. But the thing about that is, reality tends to be a pretty grim, even if you're telling a fantasized version of it. And I think you can see the evidence of that in things like, for example, Game of Thrones, which is largely based on real historical events that are sort of, you know, given a heightened quality and worked into this fantasy world. But tonight's stories are tragic on the whole. Even if they don't always end on tragedy, some do have happy endings. They still have tragedy at their core. And I think that is more a testament to how history tends to go, especially if you're, you know, a princess, than anything else. So I will say that. If you are looking for something that has a happier ending, the second story has the happiest of the two endings. The first story is tragedy all the way through, and it has one hell of an ending that I promise you will not see coming. Anyhow, exactly why does the one thing I do want to say is I mentioned Shakespeare, right? I mentioned Greeks and stuff. There's reasons why those get associated with the forms of stories, and in no small part it was when Rome conquered Greece. They wanted the land, but they kind of liked the culture. So they were really big proponents of the culture, and it sort of led to it being spread in Europe, so that lots of Greek myth and story got told throughout Europe and held up by who was the sort of dominant culture of Romans for a long time. And on the flip side, I won't go too deep into this because it's only part of the story, but Shakespeare being held up as like the greatest English language, whatever you hear about it, is a little bit engineered by certain people about 150 to 200 years ago who had particular goals that I would say are not terribly savory. That isn't to say that Shakespeare isn't a great playwright, but what I am trying to emphasize is that I think between those two things, how Western culture looks at Greek plays and stories and how Western culture looks at Shakespearean catalogs, tends to be like they owned it. That's where tragedy came from, those two sources, and Shakespeare took from Greek and whatever else, which is true. And I hope tonight that we can see that's not entirely true. Lots of cultures have their own versions of those same stories, and that's because, as I've said on the show before, narrative is built by communities, not individual authors. Anyhow, let's get to the story. Our first story starts in a castle, so let's give ourselves a little bit of that. Take down the fire volume a bit. Let's say it's windy. And I'm going to take a drink of water, and then we are going to read. Our first story tonight comes from The Count of Windeck, and it is a translation by Jürgen Hubert, a contemporary translator who you can support in the Patreon in the pinned comment below if we're not live. And it is a tragic story with a hell of an ending. And if you're in the live chat, give me your best guess of what the end twist will be. Even today, the monumental ruins of the former Count's Castle Windeck can be seen on rocky heights in the district of Waldbrühl, close to the village of Rossbach in the county of Berg. Though in its final days it became little more than the residence of an administrator. The last of the old Count's lineage, Windeck, who inhabited this castle, was Count Conrad. After he'd been absent for a long time while joining the crusade in the Holy Land that was preached by Saint Bernard, he spent his days in quietude in the castle of his ancestors. His spouse had died, unfortunately, some time ago, and only a single daughter remained from this union, a very beautiful girl named Berta. He intended to marry her off to someone of equal rank and then bequeath the castle, county, and, of course, his name to his son-in-law. Then, thanks to the influence of his sister, who was the abbess of Rheindorf, he suddenly changed his mind. He decided to dedicate his daughter to the Lord, and since he had no one to continue his family name, bequeath his possessions to the above-mentioned monastery. However, he had not taken the heart of his daughter into account with this plan, as fathers in these stories often don't, as it had already made another choice. It was a young knight from the region whose name was Heinrich von Wiedenfels, who once had been a very welcome visitor to the Count, seemingly encouraged by the Count in his courtship of the Count's daughter. Keep that in mind. The knight became secretly engaged with his daughter. Engaged here does not mean what we mean it in modern time. I will leave it at that. But when he stepped before the father and asked for the hand of the young countess, he was disdainfully rejected. Furthermore, he announced to the girl that she should have to move into the monastery with her aunt very soon, so that she would learn to forget her love for the young knight and the solitude of its walls. But the knight still managed to convey to his lover that he would come in the very next night in order to abduct her and thus keep her from the monastery which she feared so much. Well, in this manner, he climbed on his steed when the sun had gone down, but strangely that steed seemed to shy away from some unknown thing when it was supposed to stride along the often trodden road. The steed did not want to walk over the bridge which united the shores of the Ziege River, where his castle was with the other side, where Castle Windeck was standing. He had to pull the horse over by force. But on the other side, he tied it up at the foot of the castle, and then hurried up into the arms of his Berta. Initially, she seemed to refuse to follow him. But finally she let herself be talked into agreeing to his plan, and followed him down into the valley. And there he put her on his steed, and hurriedly started back on the way he had come. But although no danger was visible, the maiden was unable to master her fears and constantly pushed her lover to accelerate the ride. He did so, but the closer they came to the Zieg River, the more unruly did the normally tame horse become. And when they now heard hoofbeats that could no longer doubt that the old count was pursuing them, and thus utmost speed became a necessity. And the horse reared up just when they reached the bridge, and it became so violent and wild that the knight did not dare pass the bridge, but turned left between the trees and raced over crevices and thickets into the middle of the forest, hoping to elude the pursuers in this way. However, this unpaved path also showed the pursuers the trail of these refugees. And so they hurried after him, and while their horses were still full of strength, the horse of the knight of Weidenfels became visibly exhausted, and in this manner he had reached a cliff beneath which the Zieg River was rushing onwards. He could go neither backwards nor to the side, and thus hoped to save himself through a jump into the depths. And when the pursuers were already within sight, he spurred his steed and flew into the waves. Well, when the Count had arrived on the same rock where the bridal couple had just stood, he stared down into the depths and hoped that the steed and the two riders would surface again. But he waited in vain. Only at noon did his servants pull two rigid corpses to the shore. In sorrow, the Count retreated to his castle, and he died on the third day, and his sworn servants carried his shield and helmet before the throne of Emperor Frederick II, who was in Aachen at the time, 1174. The latter then bestowed the orphaned county as a fief to Count Engelbert von Berg. But even today, and before I say this last paragraph, last chance to guess, because this is the paragraph. But even today, Count Conrad supposedly sneaks in the ruins of Castle Windeck every night as a silver-curled ghost, before searching his children along the Zieg River, until he finally throws himself off the same rock cliff. For unfortunately, this knight of Weidenfels had been his son, which he had sired with his mother in sin. He had discovered the knight's blossoming romance with his daughter too late, and had shied away from telling the truth to the two that they were siblings. Instead, he wished to separate them under the pretext of devoutness, but he had failed to do so, even in death. How's that for Greek tragedy? Shayna Tower says he drowns. Well, you were correct about that. You get half points. One thing I think that, you have to get used to with old styles of writing is they don't follow like the sort of fair play way of writing that we do now. Like if I just jammed a twist at the end like this, people would be like, terrible writing. It's not fair at all. GS says, oh, nope. Didn't guess. Very tragedy. Yes. This is such a classic form of tragedy. I mean, the really classic Greek tragedy, of course, is Oedipus. Although Oedipus is telling a very different tale, it also is like the worst thing you can do. is this incestuous relationship he gets in. This one is so believable to me that I feel like it's probably a true story. I have no evidence of this, by the way. So don't anybody quote me or go around telling people that this is real. This is probably a tale. But it's hard for me not to see how completely accurate this could be. It doesn't feel fantastical. It feels like a thing, especially in 1174, that probably happened. Shayna Towers is very tragic. Yeah. I'll give you guys a chance to chew on the tragedy there. I'm going to have a drink, and then we're going to go into a drink of my, of course, neutral and unexplained silver can that is associated to no brands whatsoever and is merely a sweet pop. And that's just my joke about I don't endorse any brands. But then we'll go on to the next story, which also has tragedy in it, but it isn't quite as tragic, I think. Also, I like the beginning. I don't normally read Jurgen's notes, and I'm not really going to read many here, but I do like the beginning of Jurgen's commentary, which is a thing you can get if you support him on his Patreon, so I do recommend it. That says, the opening line of his commentary is, poor communication kills, as is shown here. Yes. Which is a good moral. Okay. Our second and last story of the night is a longer story, though I still think we'll probably finish early. Let's turn off the rain. Shayna Towers says, is the half-sibling romance a trope? That's a question for Jurgen. I don't know if it's a trope in German folklore. I have seen versions of it elsewhere, but I couldn't name where. It's been something I've seen it around. Gia says, I think it could be true because it didn't over elaborate like fairy tales do. Yeah, I think it's also possible that they didn't die or anything, right? Like, it's possible this was true, but they sort of made it a little more moral than it actually was. Or at least, when I say moral here, I mean to the people who would have cared about such things at this time, which were largely Christian morals. GS says, I think in operas, yes, I will take GS's word on that. Incest and tragedy go together often. I will say that much, at least. I do know that. And I think you can point to the Greeks as being one of the original sources of that kind of thing. But, I mean, it's not hard to imagine why. If you're in tragedy, you're looking for, like, what is the worst thing? Because tragedy, like all sort of branches of melodrama, are about highs and lows. So, like, what's the worst thing you can do? For a lot of cultures, it's incest. Including ours. Like, I'm not trying to be diplomatic there. I'm sure there are exceptions where this wouldn't be a tragic story. Okay. Anyways. GS says they didn't have as many people to choose from, especially if you're, like, being really restrictive about bloodlines. Our last story of the night is called The Stone Cross of Teufelsthal Valley. And it is a translation by Jürgen Hubert, who is a contemporary translator who has a Patreon that you should support down in the pinned comment below if we are not live. In his collection, Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles. And it is, again, a tragic romance, though a little less tragic. Now, there was once a devout and good-natured girl named Emelina who lived in quiet, almost monastic solitude with her aunt, Frau Clara. She was wholly separated from the world, remote from all the worldly things. Frau Clara had once lived among the throngs of people, and found that all the allures of such life were not worth the splendors that are promised to be revealed to us one day. In other words, heaven. Thus she lived her life according to such measures well into her later years, and so did her ward, Emelina. Now the lonely house inhabited by the two hermits was in a gloomy region at the foot of the Wild Owl Mountains, and it had just a beautiful garden. And it had an old faithful servant who took care of the household duties fit for a man. Emelina had never seen the wider world, and even her childhood had passed away in these rough regions. She knew nothing other than the cherry trees and the tall lindens which shadowed the small house, as well as the stone cross which stood between spruce trees at the foot of a coarse rock. Frequently, old Curd had told her, that's the servant of the house, the old man, had told her that a young knight had slain his cousin out of greed in a duel. Now, Emelina often sat here and stared into the small, bright pond which was located in the front of the memorial. She would enjoy the flocks of birds and listen to the stag, which approached the waters daily and slowly walked up and down along its shores. This was Emelina's world, and she only knew about the life and activities beyond the mountains of her valley from the tales of old Curd. He told of tournaments, how knights sat on high, splendid horses, and how they wore mirror bright armor with marvelously decorated helmets on which tall heron feathers bobbed up and down. But no stranger's foot touched their region, and her barely grasped vision dissolved in the image of old Curd, the only man she'd ever known. Now one year, after another flew past for her in this manner, lightly and joyfully. The trees had flowered and borne fruit 18 times in her life, which is one of the coolest ways of counting years I've ever seen in a story. And she knew of no other desire than to support Frau Clara in her work. In this manner she became a true beauty who was richly supplied and adorned by nature, and whose heart was pure and unsullied. Frau Clara was a wise woman who had taught her many things. Emelina could read and write and knew all the tales of the Bible. And when she celebrated her 19th birthday and Curd had woven a basket for her, he filled it with flowers so that she could tie them together. She thanked him in gratitude. She thanked him in gratitude and went to the cross beneath the spruces in order to weave a wreath and put it into the water so that it would stay green and flower, stay fresh. Emelina sat there all alone when she heard the barking of many dogs. They were in the distance, and a dull assemblage of voices began to reach her ear. She startled and trembled, for this was the first time she was disturbed here. And suddenly the stag, which visited the pond daily, rushed past with the greatest hurry. He was already exhausted and wheezing, and was followed by many dogs who raced after him at great speed. And suddenly the men's voice echoed above her, and she beheld the shapes of men on top of the cliff, which rose above the cross. A young knight with long waves of blonde hair, was prominent among them, and dutiful squire kept him away from the precipice, where he wanted to kneel down. "For God's sakes, noble lord, in living memory no one dared go into this valley, not since your grandfather slew the noble Albert at that sight of that cross." The startled Emelina fled, rushed into the hut, where she told her aunt of the apparition. And the overheard words with a breathless voice. Then Clara realized that the grandson of their archenemy, the Knight of Cunau, had appeared before her trembling ward. While fearing that new pursuit might threaten them, she hurriedly embarked from the Hermitage, together with her ward, and only left old Curd behind, without suspecting what impression the appearance of the knight had made in the heart of the innocent Emelina. And Gottfried von Cunau was the liege lord of the entire Weistritz Valley, and had indeed taken notice of the fleeing maiden, as well as the hut hidden beneath the trees. Indeed, since Emelina had looked up to him with startlement, but also astonishment. As I say, it's not a Fireside Fairy Tale unless I kick the camera. And initially hesitated whether he should flee or stay. Her gaze and her face had left a deep impression on him. He was smitten. This left him no peace in his castle. Though the fear of his squire that an infernal haunting had appeared before him in that infernal valley made him initially hesitant to make any further attempts to go there. Now, I didn't quite pick this up at first, but there's basically a sort of myth that there is a haunting there. They don't really go too specific, but for those who, like me, didn't pick up on it right away. And that haunting is caused by the spirit that was unjustly killed by his relatives. In secret, though, the knight hurried away from the castle, and soon he found himself at that same spot where his gaze had pursued the fleeing stag, and where such a friendly apparition had startled him. Furtively, he glanced towards the hut between the trees, and he did not behold the lovely shape of the maiden. Then he climbed down from the rock, and wandered along the shores of the pond towards the hut. And before the entrance there was an arbor of linden trees, which was the work of the old Curd. Everything was empty and quiet. No friendly voice prompted him to enter when he knocked at the door. It was unlocked, and so he stepped into a small entry hall, and beyond it, the living room. Here, too, everything was empty. A chair, a table, a few beds. Was everything that his gaze could behold, but inevitably and with dread, a portrait hanging on the wall pulled his gaze towards it. He was not prepared for what he saw. In the painting, a knight was depicted, who was thrusting his sword into the chest of an unarmored foe, who kneeled before him. At some distance, off in the background, a noblewoman with tear-stained eyes held a small boy into the air so that the small one had to witness the murder of his father. And above the painting there was the inscription, "The blood of those who have spilled the blood of humans shall have their own blood spilled by the humans in turn." and beneath the same, God shall avenge the sins of the fathers among the children until the third or fourth generation. More with grief than despair did Gottfried realize that he was in the house of the lineage that was his bitter enemy, well, at least by necessity, and which his grandfather had insulted so deeply with his cruel act. He knew likewise that the Lonely Cross was witness to the perpetrated misdeed and linked to this house where the unfortunate descendants of the murdered man had sought a simple and hidden refuge. The maiden whose appearance had moved him so much had become a scion of that unfortunate lineage, but it was clear to him he must atone what his ancestor had shattered if such reconciliation could be accepted. And he blessed the day of the hunt which had led him there and allowed him to discover the maiden. Then footsteps thudded through the house, and an old man in a common vest stood before him. It was Kurd. "You are Gottfried von Kuensberg," said the old one, "and seek the grandfather of the man who was murdered by your grandfather. Perhaps you're here to slay the final scion of the lineage hated so much by your bloodline. Well, your hopes are in vain. We suspected your turn, and Emelina with her Aunt Clara has fled from your wrath. You shall find her nowhere." But the young man, assured that such depravity had never crossed his mind, he had heard a dark legend about his ancestors' misdeeds, but he did not know the gruesome details of what happened. He had no intention of bringing doom to the maiden, but to atone for the crime of his grandfather, and he would be glad to offer his hand to the wronged girl as recompense, for her gaze, her shape were so clear in his mind that he would know and find her in any region as if he had known her for years. Kurd replied, "Never. Never will Clara give the last scion of her lineage to the arch enemy of the Fiechenbergs as a wife. Never shall the knight of the Kuensberg lead Emelina to the bloodline of the Kuensborg." Just a pause, because those are, to an English speaker, two words. A knight of an area, and then the other one refers to a castle. I had to look this up. So, blood-stained castle is what he's saying. "Hear of your ancestors' depravity now. Your grandfather, Willibald, was lord of the region of Kuenau, including Kuensberg Castle, up to the large black coal pit. But Albert von Fiechenberg owned the larger part of the Owl Mountains and Weistritz Valley. Then your grandfather became greedy. He desired the valley and declared a feud against the noble Albert, who was his cousin no less, without cause. And one day he lured him here into this Teufelsthal under the pretense of peacefully negotiating with him, and provoked the unarmored man to a duel when he believed himself to be alone with him. Then he ignominiously thrust his sword into the latter's chest Albert's wife, who was driven by a sense of foreboding to follow him, witnessed the horrible death of her husband from afar, as shown in that painting behind you. Shane says lots of fricatives, you're telling me. Without any great resistance, Willibald subsequently took possession of all the lands which belonged to Albert, and Albert's wife suffered the rest of her life in the dungeons of Kinsbark Castle. Albert's son, Ennavold, boy of 7 years, and his younger sister Clara were saved. They fled with the help of a young squire and were secretly raised in a monastery near Breslau. At the altar of the Church of St. Elizabeth. Before the face of God and the Holy Virgin Mary, young Ennavold and his sister Clara swore revenge and eternal enmity, while clasping the hand of the young squire who had saved them. And so that the horrible deed should remain vivid in the children of Albert, the squire commissioned this painting. They did not find revenge, for Ennavold fell during a crusade and left behind his sister Clara, his wife, a Fräulein Seidlitz, and his daughter. The mother, too, joined her ancestors, and now Clara could do nothing else but to raise the lost daughter of an unfortunate lineage and educate her far from the world and all worldly things as she could, as she had promised it to the mother on her deathbed, so that she could be later dedicated to God in a monastery. The squire who had saved Clara and her brother even brought them to this hidden refuge. For it was me. And the desire for revenge and the deep hatred have not yet dwindled. Hurry from here. Nothing evil shall happen to you here, for Curd shall not sully his hands with blood, but Emelina's far gone, and you shall never see her again. I will atone, shouted Godfried. What my ancestor has perpetrated, I offer my heart, my hand to the lovely apparition which I saw here from atop that rock to the cross of Albert of Feichenberg. Never, replied Curd. If you were to lead her home to the proud Kinsberg castle, could you prevent her from gazing into the castle dungeons where her wailing grandmother ended her life between their walls? Could you thwart her from looking at the desolate Feichenberg where the castle of her ancestors stood, which was raised in the living memory by your father? There can never be atonement. Once more, leave this place. While grieving, Gottfried slunk out of the hut, climbed up the rock cliff, and lurched towards his castle. The next morning, the rising sun saw him not defeated, but on the road to Breslau, only accompanied by his squire, in order to atone for his devastation in a monastery in a manner similar to Emelina. Gonna drink some water, because that was a hell of a voice to do that long. Hope it's not too noticeable that I choked on my own water while I was drinking it. Well, the next morning, the bells of St. Elizabeth Church solemnly rang for their invitation to the Lord's service. Gottfried had dressed himself splendidly and hurried to hear the Mass. The Lord's house was thronged. But when the priest who had read the sermon raised the holy host, for those who have absolutely zero religious background in Christianity or anything, the holy host is like basically a wine and biscuits. I mean, it's more than that, but I'll let you look it up if you want. And everyone sank to their knees. Gottfried suddenly noticed Emelina sitting in an elevated position next to her Aunt Clara. And she too had turned her gaze towards him, to the young man whom she had seen first during her lonely existence, and whose image was shining within her mind. While blushing, she lowered her eyes, but this blushing and the initially joyful but then hesitant gaze revealed to Gottfried what was occurring within the heart of that maiden. In his own heart, while it rapidly beat in joy and response, they were smitten. The faithful squire was tasked with following the woman and soon discovered their apartment. He also learned the news that Clara and her young niece would leave Breslau early in the morning. The squire of the night that he brought with him, because squire was used more than once. It was used here. Anyways. Where they planned to go, he did not learn, and neither did he ascertain whether the young knight was intended to be the husband for the beautiful Emelina. Gottfried quickly decided to follow her and discover where she would stay. But Clara had likewise noticed the knight and spotted how her niece had blushed. She recognized the appearance of her arch enemy in his grandson and became aware that Emelina was not nurturing the feelings of revenge that were still smoldering within her own heart. It was thus quickly decided to not wait until the morning for their journey, but to travel to the castle of Erhard von Zedlitz, which was near, and I'm going to say this wrong, and I cannot figure out the right way to say it, so I apologize to the entire country of Germany and everyone who uses this language. Zobenberg. Zobentenberg mountain. And Erhard, who was close to the Fikenberg lineage through ties of gratitude, readily agreed to accompany them at night, for path and trail were well known to him. While Gottfried still dwelled in sweet dreams, Emelina was already far away from the gates of Breslau. And the squire, who had been sent forth, returned early with the news that Emelina was no longer within Breslau's walls. But nobody could say where she'd been brought. So then, Gottfried, he jumped on his horse and restlessly wandered forth, straying around the entirety of Silesia and the surrounding lands, but in vain, for there was no news to be found of Emelina and her aunt. Sorry, I clicked the wrong button here. 2 years had passed when Gottfried rode back into his castle at Kinsberg, and he was exhausted from the vain searches and just as sad and despairing as he had been when he had left it. Numbly, he listened to the news that the Boers were roaming the region near Fikenberg and terrified the area with their depredations. It was then that a thought came to him that perhaps Kurt still lived in the hut and could give him news. Thus he gathered the squires for a boar hunt in Teufelsthal Valley. But those made the sign of the cross and pleaded with him to give up these thoughts, For the Teufelsthal was more terrible than ever before, as horrible figures dwelled within it and appeared in a threatening manner to the gazes of those who lost their way and ended up there. But Gottfried had only one thought in his mind, and quickly he raced towards the wilderness on his steed, accompanied by the two squires, still doing their cross. Arriving on the heights of the Fikenberg mountain, he looked into the eerie valley. The small hut, it was gone, and a large house stood in its place. His steed was left behind, and the knight climbed down the rocky cliff face above the cross, accompanied by his squires. It was then that he heard voices from the from the direction of the stone cross. It was a threatening one from a man, a wailing one from a girl. The sound of the female voice moved the knight marvelously, and everything that he had more than 2 years ago reawakened in him like a bloom in the dew of spring. He silently crept closer in order to listen to the speakers, and as soon as he had pushed the branches aside and looked down, he beheld Emelina. But she was kneeling down next to the cross, and she had pleadingly raised her hands against a threatening, horrible figure of a man who stood above her and was armed with a dagger. Seeing this, sliding towards him and cutting the man, threatening the maiden down, was the work of a moment's notice, and the blood, the smoking blood, sprayed over the gray cross. But he had been noticed. Horrible figures pushed out of the house and towards the pond into his direction. And then Emelina screamed, "Save yourself! Bandits and murderers dwell in the house, and you killed their leader!" "Whether I live or fall, I shall only do so with you, Emelina!" shouted the knight, and grabbed the trembling girl with his strong arms. This is some straight romance novel stuff. And quickly and desperately climbed up the rock while carrying a full-sized adult woman. The squires followed him, ready to sell their blood and their lives dearly for their lord. Love and faithfulness quickened their steps and strengthened their feet and arms, and the height was climbed before the threatening shapes could come closer. And when the squires and the knight and Emelina reached their horses, Gottfried climbed up on his steed together with his precious find, and they hurried down Fikenberg in a speedy trot. They raced down across the Stenselberg mountain, along the valley of Weistritz, and towards Kinsberg Castle, in a manner that the inhabitants of the valley thought that the wild huntsman had rode past them on this bright morning. The horrible figures of Teufelsthal Valley ran after them in desperate haste, pursuing him and his treasure of Emelina until they finally gave up pursuit and collapsed wheezing at the foot of Stenselberg mountain. But Gottfried brought Emelina up into his Kinsberg castle, hale and whole, and here the rescued woman told him how she had vanished and been concealed for so long. In the night, when I had to flee with Frau Clara towards the castle of Erhard von Zettlitz, bandits found us and killed Knight Erhard. Then they abducted us and carried us to a castle which was ablaze with flame. For this was the hideout of the leader of the bandits, but a brave knight had set it on fire. While driven away in this manner, the bandits turned into the Teufelsthal, which was well known to and beloved by me, and where they hoped for the greatest safety. Disguised as horrible, devilish figures, they roamed the valley, made use of the fear and dread which the name of the valley instilled in wanderers and people living nearby. In this manner they plied their evil trade in the valley for 2 years. They abducted many noble knights and women during the night and mistreated and murdered them. Us, too, awaited this horrible fate. Perhaps an even more dreadful fate was in store for me. But then God gave me an idea. Since my former acquaintance with the Teufelsthal Valley was known to them, I claimed there was a great treasure lying beneath the stone cross, which could only be lifted by a pure girl after 2 years, on the day of Saint Valporga, between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. In this manner I preserved myself, sighed and prayed for 2 years, and hoped for God that he would send a Savior who would save me from the claws of the villains before this time was up. My aunt could only stand the fear and sorrow for 1 year. She departed from this earth in sorrow, but still maintained hope I would have had a better fate. For she had a premonition that you, knight of her archenemy, would become my savior. And she ordered me to tell you that she deeply regretted her previous acrimony and gave you her blessing. Faithful Curd had fallen earlier under the daggers of the bandits, and it was on Valporga's day when the brute pulled me to the stone and threatened to murder me if I wouldn't help with lifting the treasure. His dagger was already above me when you appeared. God's got a sense of timing. When Gottfried heard this narrative, he summoned his men, climbed up on his steed, and surrounded the Teufelsthal, and had all the bandits captured. Only a few of them escaped the sword and his revenge. Even today, though, people show the remains of the great castle dungeon where the bandits received repayment for their deeds, but Emelina became the wife of Gottfried, and thus the shades of her grandfather and her grandmother were reconciled. For now a fortunate line blossomed on the castle, which had once seen the tears and sorrow of Emelina's grandmother. Try not to think too hard about the fact that the man he killed was his cousin. Anyways, there you go. Wow, that took much longer than I thought. Apparently, I must have enjoyed that story when I first read it, because I thought it was much shorter than it was. Shayna Towers says, side eyes in church, and then has the crying, laughing emoji. Yeah. I do appreciate how, like, boldly this is about this, you know, they're how much they are endeared to each other, to put it one way. And GS said, we didn't forget. Would I get more views if I said 2 stories of incest? I don't think so. Although I will say this is for the time frame, that's pretty mild. I will say that you know, there is more complexity to that than we might think. Yeah, Shayna Tara says at least would make them at least second, if not third cousins at least. Yeah, and for those who know about the genetics of this, from my understanding, at that point, while there is a heightened risk, it is much, much reduced. But it had definitely, in our time, would seem weird. But, you got to keep in mind that there's like a tenth the population in the world, and they live on tiny little places. Like, you inevitably were probably going to hook up with a cousin at some point. That's still a problem to this day in small communities. I think it's a problem in I forget where it is, but there's a place where you actually are supposed to check your lineage to make sure you're not accidentally dating a first cousin. Anyways, that's not really the point of it was supposed to be tragedy and romance, and I hope that it delivered on that, and that it's not too smeared by the fact that they're both about incest. Anyhow, yeah, I those are my two tales of German romance and tragedy. They're not the only tales of German romance and tragedy, and you can read more of them for yourself if you want to go and check out Jürgen Hubert's Patreon. But for a couple of bucks a month, you get a bunch of stories. He translates pretty prolifically, actually. And he also watches these streams. So if you have questions, your last chance to put them in the chat if you want to ask him anything. As far as me and my somewhat dogged out voice from doing card, I really appreciate you coming and hanging around with me, Shayna and GS, and I appreciate everybody who lingers and watches the VOD later and so on. Thank you so much. Please do remember to give it a like if you liked it, because that's the little applause. That's about the only feedback I ever get, and I greatly appreciate it. If you really liked it and you're like, man, can I do anything else? These streams actually do take a fair bit of work to put together. I mean, not a ton, but it's like an 8-hour day spread out a little bit, but it works out to about 8 hours a week to do this one stream. If you have the means and you have the will, I do have a little coffee link, buy me a coffee link down below. It's not the literal buy me a coffee, it's the other one, but I really appreciate that for the few that are able to do that. But for the rest of you, I really just appreciate the audience. And thank you so much for coming and enjoying Folklore with me. I really enjoy reading it. That's my primary enjoyment of this. Shayna Tower says it did cover tragedy and romance categories. Hopefully, yeah. And hopefully it scratches that itch if you came here looking for that itch to be scratched. I could have said that in a less weird way. Anyhow, let me turn off the rain here. Thank you so much, everybody, nonetheless, for coming and enjoying old Folklore with me. I'll keep the fire warm for you, or the ice cold in my case. So I'm going to go turn my air conditioning on. Have a good sleep.